subscribe, like, comment, because once you hear what really happens behind these fences, you won't look at prisons the same way again. The alarm went off at 2:17 a.m. Inside Redstone Correctional Facility, a maximum security prison buried deep in the American desert, alarms didn't go off unless something had gone very wrong. Officer Daniel Mercer was already on his feet before the second siren screamed through the concrete corridors. Years on the job had trained his body to react faster than his thoughts. By the time Mercer reached C Block, the unit was silent. Too silent. Inmate lights were on, casting a cold blue glow across steel bars and concrete floors. Men stood inside their cells, hands gripping the bars, faces unreadable. No shouting, no chaos, just hundreds of eyes watching. Mercer's radio crackled. "We have an unresponsive inmate in C Block lower tier." When he turned the corner, he saw the body. Inmate Luis Moreno lay on the floor near the showers, still untouched. Moreno wasn't just another inmate. He was known, respected, feared, a man connected, protected. The kind of inmate who didn't end up like this unless someone powerful had allowed it. There were no visible signs of a struggle. No witnesses stepping forward. No obvious explanation. That was the first warning. Within minutes, supervisors arrived. Cameras were reviewed. Guards were questioned, but something didn't add up. Cameras had conveniently gone dark for 6 minutes. Radios had gone silent at the same time. And not a single inmate claimed to have seen anything. Mercer had seen violence before. Fights, riots, chaos. But this felt different. Controlled, surgical. As dawn crept over the razor wire, whispers spread through the prison like smoke. Not panic understanding. Moreno hadn't been killed because of a fight. He had been removed, and everyone knew why. Behind the fence, there were 5 groups that mattered. 5 prison gangs that didn't need uniforms or badges. They enforced rules without writing them down. They decided who ate, who was protected, who survived. The Aryan Brotherhood, the Mexican Mafia, the Black Guerrilla Family, the Texas Syndicate, the United Blood Nation. Different colors, different origins, one shared truth. They ran the prison. Mercer learned that lesson his first year on the job. A veteran officer had pulled him aside and spoken quietly, like sharing a secret you don't want overheard. Don't try to control what you don't understand. The rules in the handbook aren't the real rules. At the time, Mercer thought it was cynicism. Now he knew it was survival advice. Moreno's death sent shockwaves far beyond C Block. In the days that followed, inmates began moving differently. Certain tables in the mess hall emptied. Some men suddenly received protection they hadn't earned. Others were isolated overnight. The guards noticed, too. Routine searches turned tense. Radios malfunctioned. Anonymous tips disappeared. Every attempt to assert authority was met with quiet resistance. Not riots, not violence. Silence, the most dangerous weapon inside a prison. Mercer started noticing patterns. Inmates who shouldn't have access to phones had them. Orders passed between units without words. A nod here, a pause there. Entire blocks shifting behavior like they'd received the same memo. And then came the file. Late one night, Mercer was called into the lieutenant's office. The door was closed behind him, the blinds drawn. On the desk sat an internal report stamped confidential. 5 names were circled in red, one from each major gang. "These men don't share space," the lieutenant said quietly, "but intelligence says they're coordinating." Mercer felt his stomach tighten. Rival gangs working together wasn't just rare, it was catastrophic. "What's the motive?" Mercer asked. The lieutenant leaned back. "Control, not just inside, beyond these walls." That was when Mercer understood something chilling. The fence wasn't there to keep the gangs in. It was there to keep the rest of the world out. As Mercer reached for the file, his eyes caught a final note scribbled at the bottom of the page. Moreno wasn't a victim. He was a message, and somewhere inside Redstone Correctional Facility, the people truly in charge were preparing to send another one. But when Mercer turned the page to see what came next, what he found changed everything. By the time the sun rose fully over Redstone Correctional Facility, The prison had already adjusted to Luis Moreno's absence. That was the part that unsettled Officer Daniel Mercer the most. No outrage, no retaliation, just order, a natural, disciplined order. In prison, chaos usually followed death. This time, the opposite happened. The yard opened at 9 a.m., and Mercer watched from the tower as inmates filed out in clean, deliberate lines. The usual tension between rival groups was gone. Men who never stood near each other before now shared space without a word. It looked peaceful, but Mercer knew better. This wasn't calm. It was coordination. Down on the concrete, authority had shifted. The Aryan Brotherhood occupied their usual corner near the pull-up bars. Across the yard, members tied to the Mexican Mafia stood near the fence line, talking quietly with men connected to the Texas Syndicate. The Black Guerrilla family moved between them, acting less like rivals and more like messengers. And scattered throughout the yard were members of the United Blood Nation, positioned like sentries. Mercer felt it, then the invisible map of power laid over the yard, replacing the one drawn by prison administrators. Inside, the mess hall told the same story. Certain tables filled instantly. Others stayed empty. New inmates instinctively avoided the wrong seats without being told. Food trays changed hands without argument. Protection was granted or withdrawn with subtle gestures. Mercer asked a younger officer what he thought. The officer shrugged nervously. Feels like everyone already knows what not to do. That was the point. Later that afternoon, Mercer was assigned to escort duty through D Unit, one of the oldest wings in the facility. The walls there were cracked and stained, the air thick with years of confinement. As they passed cell after cell, inmates stepped back without being ordered. No defiance. No eye contact. At cell 217, Mercer slowed. Inside sat Raymond Ghost Calderon, a man tied to multiple gangs, but officially confirmed with none. Ghost had survived 12 years in Redstone without a single disciplinary infraction. That alone made him dangerous. Rough night, Ghost said calmly, never looking up from his book. Mercer stopped. You hear anything about Moreno? Ghost smiled slightly. Everyone heard. No one saw anything. That's because it wasn't meant to be seen. Mercer felt the hairs on his arms rise. You saying it was ordered? Ghost finally looked up. I'm saying prisons don't run on impulse. They run on permission. Before Mercer could respond, a supervisor signaled for him to move on. As they walked away, Ghost's voice followed him down the tier. Behind the fence, officer, the loudest moves are silent. That night, Mercer reviewed surveillance logs again. The 6-minute blackout during Moreno's death wasn't random. It matched a pattern short outages that had occurred before other unexplained incidents over the years. Each time, someone important disappeared, transferred, or suddenly lost protection. Mercer dug deeper. He found disciplinary reports altered after submission. Transfers delayed without explanation. Inmates placed in specific cells that made no logistical sense unless you understood the hierarchy. The gangs weren't reacting to the system. They were using it. And then Mercer made his biggest mistake. He shared his findings with Officer Jacob Harlan, a man he trusted. They'd trained together, covered for each other, survived lockdown side by side. Harlan listened quietly, then nodded. Careful, Danny. You're seeing things that aren't meant to be followed. Someone has to stop it, Mercer said. They're coordinating. This isn't survival anymore. It's governance. Harlan's expression tightened. You don't stop something like this. You survive it. The next morning, Harlan didn't show up for shift. No call. No notice. By noon, Mercer learned Harlan had been transferred quietly, urgent Lido, a facility 3 states away. No explanation. No paperwork trail. Just erased. That's when Mercer understood the true danger. The gangs weren't just controlling inmates. They were deciding which guards stayed, which disappeared, and which ones learned to stay silent. And if Mercer kept pushing, he knew exactly where he'd end up next. But as he returned to his locker that evening, he found something waiting for him inside. A folded note. No name. No threat. Just 4 words, written in block letters. You're already noticed. Mercer stared at it, heart pounding, realizing the investigation wasn't something he was doing anymore. It was something happening to him, and the people behind the fence were now watching his every move. By the time Daniel Mercer reached the front gate that night, he understood something he had never been trained for. Redstone Correctional Facility wasn't broken. It was functioning exactly as designed, just not for the people who thought they were in charge. The folded note stayed in Mercer's pocket for hours, its weight heavier than any weapon. You already noticed. It wasn't a threat. It was confirmation. Somewhere inside those walls, a decision had already been made about him. The next morning, the warden called an emergency staff briefing. The room was tense, filled with uniforms and silence. Moreno's death had officially been labeled under investigation, but no one asked questions anymore. They already knew better. New procedures were announced. Yard times adjusted. Cell transfers approved without explanation. Entire housing units reshuffled overnight. Mercer watched it all happen in real time. The gangs weren't reacting to policy changes. The policy changes were reacting to them. Later that day, Mercer was assigned to escort duty near administrative segregation. As he passed the reinforced doors, he noticed something that made his chest tighten. 5 inmates never housed near one another had been scheduled for medical appointments within the same hour. 5 men, 5 affiliations, 1 coordination point. The paperwork looked official. Perfect, even too perfect. As Mercer escorted the last inmate back to his unit, a voice stopped him. "You don't need to finish this." It was the warden. They stood alone in the corridor, fluorescent lights humming above them. The warden didn't look angry. He looked tired. "You've seen enough," the warden said quietly. "More than most officers ever do." Mercer held his ground. "Sir, this facility isn't under our control." The warden exhaled slowly. "It hasn't been for a long time." That was the moment everything clicked. The system hadn't lost control by accident. It had adapted. Cooperation was easier than confrontation. Stability was valued over truth. As long as violence stayed low and order remained, no one outside the fence wanted to know how it was achieved. The gangs provided that order. They settled disputes before they escalated. They controlled contraband flow to avoid chaos. They enforced discipline more efficiently than any policy manual ever could. And in return, the system looked the other way. Mercer's investigation hadn't uncovered corruption. It had uncovered compromise. That evening, Mercer requested access to one final report, Moreno's original intake file. Buried deep inside was a note from years earlier, flagged but ignored. Inmate shows signs of cross-gang influence. Potential destabilization risk. Moreno hadn't been killed for defiance. He'd been removed for imbalance. Mercer closed the file, understanding now why no one talked. Why no one resisted. Why silence ruled. The fence didn't exist to contain the gangs. It existed to protect the illusion that they didn't exist at all. 2 days later, Mercer received his transfer notice. No explanation. No appeal. Another facility. Another state. As he packed his locker, he noticed something carved faintly into the metal, something he hadn't seen before. 5 small marks, etched carefully side by side. Not names. Not symbols. Just a reminder. On his way out, Mercer took one last look through the yard. Inmates moved with quiet purpose. Guards watched without interference. The machine ran smoothly. Too smoothly. Mercer walked through the final gate, the fence closing behind him with a heavy metallic echo. And for the first time, he realized the truth most people never would. Behind the fence, the law wears a uniform. But power doesn't. And the people who truly run U.S. prisons will never need to introduce themselves. They already know who's watching. If this story unsettled you, you're not ready for the next one. Hit subscribe, because behind these walls, the truth never stays buried for long.